At 41 years old, David Harper walked out of his office carrying everything he still owned in a cardboard box. 20 years with the same retail company ended in less than 15 minutes. The regional manager shook his hand, thanked him for his loyalty, and explained that the store was closing permanently. "It isn't personal," he said, but for David, it felt exactly that way. He drove home in silence, wondering how he was supposed to start over at an age when most people were planning for retirement instead of unemployment. Then, 3 days later, his phone rang. A lawyer informed him that a distant uncle he barely remembered had passed away. David expected to hear about a small savings account, or perhaps nothing at all. Instead, he inherited an abandoned general store in a tiny town he hadn't visited since he was a child. When he finally arrived, the old building stood exactly where he remembered it. A weathered wooden porch, dust covering the front windows, shelves still visible through the faded glass. The sign above the entrance had nearly disappeared after decades of sun and rain. Most of the townspeople assumed he would sell it immediately. One man laughed and said, "Nobody's made a living in that store for years." Another smiled politely. "Take the money while somebody's still willing to buy it." Even David believed they were probably right. He had no experience running a small-town general store. He only planned to clean it out, list it for sale, and move on with his life. But on his very first night inside, while a storm rattled the old windows, he heard a heavy wooden door slam somewhere behind the counter. The strange part, there was only one room back there, an office, a locked office. According to everyone in town, that door hadn't been opened since the day his uncle closed it decades earlier. What David eventually discovered behind that locked office door wasn't hidden money or a forgotten inheritance, but a secret that would forever change how an entire town remembered the quiet man who once stood behind that old counter every single day. Before we go back to the day David lost his job, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What city or country are you in? And what time is it where you are right now? Leave a comment below and say hello. I always enjoy seeing these stories bring people together from all around the world. And if you enjoy stories about forgotten businesses, hidden history, and ordinary people uncovering extraordinary legacies, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next adventure. Whether you're starting your morning, relaxing in the afternoon, or listening before bed, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Now, let's go back to the moment a 41-year-old man lost his job, only to inherit an old general store that was hiding far more than dusty shelves behind its locked office door. David Harper never imagined that 20 years of loyalty could fit inside a single cardboard box. At 41 years old, he sat quietly across from his regional manager while the final meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. The company had decided to close several underperforming locations, including the store David had managed for nearly 2 decades. There had been no complaints about his work, no disciplinary warnings, and no personal conflict. The decision, they assured him, was purely financial. "You've been of our most dependable managers," the regional director said as he slid a folder across the table. "I'm truly sorry it ended this way." David forced a polite smile, shook everyone's hand, and carried the cardboard box containing his framed photographs, coffee mug, notebooks, and family calendar through the front doors for the last time. Outside, the employee parking lot looked exactly as it had every morning for years. The only difference was that this time, he had nowhere to return tomorrow. The drive home felt strangely quiet. His small apartment, already lonely after years of living alone following his divorce, suddenly felt even emptier. He spent the evening updating his resume and searching job listings, but every application seemed to require younger candidates, relocation, or experience in industries completely unfamiliar to him. 3 days later, while making another cup of coffee, His phone rang. The caller introduced himself as an attorney representing the estate of Richard Harper. David frowned. He vaguely remembered meeting his great-uncle only a handful of times as a child during family gatherings. Richard had always lived in a small rural town several hours away, running an old-fashioned general store that seemed frozen in another era. "Your uncle named you in his will," the attorney explained. David expected to hear about a modest savings account or perhaps a few family keepsakes. Instead, the attorney quietly said, "He left you the store." 2 days later, David found himself driving along quiet country roads toward the little town he barely remembered. As he entered Main Street, time itself seemed to slow. Brick storefronts lined both sides of the road. A small diner stood beside the post office. The courthouse clock overlooked the square just as it had decades earlier. At the far end of the block stood Harper's General Store. The weathered wooden sign still hung above the front porch, though years of sun and rain had nearly erased the painted letters. Dust coated the large display windows. The porch boards creaked beneath his footsteps as he climbed toward the entrance. The attorney handed him an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag. "Everything inside belongs to you now," he said before leaving David alone. The heavy front door opened with a long groan. Cool air carrying the scent of aged wood, paper, coffee, and dry grain drifted into the afternoon sunlight. Inside, shelves still stretched from floor to ceiling. Glass jars lined the old counter. Handwritten price tags remained attached to hooks and bins as though the owner had expected customers to return the following morning. David slowly walked through the quiet store. Nothing had been stripped or abandoned in haste. Every shelf looked organized, despite the dust. It felt less like an empty business, and more like a place patiently waiting for someone to unlock the front door again. That afternoon, several townspeople stopped by after hearing the new owner had arrived. Some introduced themselves politely. Others simply nodded while studying David with quiet curiosity. One elderly farmer smiled kindly. "Most folks figure you'll sell the place," another man added with a shrug. "Can't blame you. Nobody's made real money in that old store for years." David nodded honestly. "I haven't made any decisions yet." The truth was simple. He fully intended to sell the building once he understood what had been left behind. Running a small-town general store had never been part of his plans. As evening settled over the town, David found an old cot stored in the stockroom and decided to spend the night inside rather than paying for a motel. Rain began falling shortly after dark, tapping softly against the front windows while wind rattled the weathered porch outside. Sometime after midnight, a loud bang echoed through the empty building. David sat upright instantly. The sound hadn't come from the front entrance. It hadn't come from outside. Grabbing a flashlight, he followed the noise toward the rear of the store, where a narrow hallway led to a single wooden office door. The heavy door stood firmly shut. An old brass lock remained mounted beneath the handle. As another gust of wind shook the building, the office door trembled slightly inside its frame before settling back into silence. David rested his hand against the worn wood. The room beyond remained completely dark, yet somehow, standing there alone in the middle of the night, he couldn't escape the feeling that whatever his uncle had chosen to leave behind was still waiting on the other side of that locked office door. David woke just after sunrise to the faint smell of old wood and coffee that still lingered inside the general store. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then he looked around at the long wooden shelves, the worn counter, and the faded advertisements hanging from the walls, and everything from the previous day came rushing back. He was unemployed. He had inherited a business he never expected to own. And somewhere behind the counter stood a locked office that no one seemed able to enter. He brewed coffee using an old enamel pot he found in the tiny employee kitchen. While waiting for the water to boil, he began opening curtains that had remained closed for years. Morning sunlight slowly filled the store, revealing shelves lined with empty flour bins, glass jars, canned goods long since removed, and wooden display cases coated with a thin layer of dust. Despite its age, the building felt surprisingly well cared for. Nothing had been vandalized. Nothing appeared abandoned in a hurry. It looked as though Richard Harper had simply closed the front door one evening and never returned. David spent the morning sweeping floors, dusting shelves, and carrying broken cardboard boxes into the alley behind the building. As he worked, several townspeople stopped outside to wave or introduce themselves. Most welcomed him politely. A few quietly admitted they were glad someone had finally unlocked the old place again. Near lunchtime, a pickup truck pulled into the parking space beside the porch. A broad-shouldered man climbed out carrying a toolbox and several pieces of lumber. "Name's Ben Cooper," he called with an easy smile. "Figured the porch could use a little attention before somebody falls through it." David laughed. "You're volunteering?" Ben shrugged. "Your uncle helped half this town over the years. Least I can do is replace a few rotten boards." Together they spent the afternoon repairing loose planks along the front porch and reinforcing the old awning that leaned slightly over the entrance. While they worked, Ben pointed toward different corners of Main Street, sharing stories about businesses that had disappeared long ago. "Your uncle's store was the one place everybody visited," he said. "Didn't matter whether you needed nails, flour, boots, or a friendly conversation." David listened with growing curiosity. "Sounds like he knew everyone." Ben smiled. He did. After finishing the repairs, Ben suggested David visit the town library. "If anyone knows the history of this place," he said, "it's Margaret Ellis." Later that afternoon, David crossed the town square and entered the small brick library. Behind the front desk stood Margaret Ellis, carefully shelving returned books. She greeted David warmly before leading him into a quiet archive room filled with filing cabinets, photographs, and local newspapers dating back more than a century. "I've been hoping you'd stop by," she admitted. She placed a large archive box labeled Harper General Store onto a reading table. Inside were faded photographs of the store during harvest festivals, newspaper advertisements announcing seasonal sales, invoices from suppliers, and community event posters sponsored by Richard Harper. One photograph showed the store packed with customers during the winter holidays. Another captured children gathered outside, receiving free candy during a town parade. Margaret smiled as David studied each picture. "Your uncle believed the store belonged to the whole town." She unfolded an original architectural blueprint of the building and spread it carefully across the table. David immediately recognized the layout. The front sales floor, stockroom, loading dock, and rear office all matched what he had seen the previous day. One small note written near the office caught his attention. "Private office." Unlike the rest of the building, the office appeared completely enclosed with only one entrance from the hallway behind the counter. "Has anyone ever gone inside after my uncle died?" David asked. Margaret slowly shook her hand. "No." "Why not?" "Because nobody ever found the key." David looked surprised. "Didn't the lawyer search?" "Everyone searched," Margaret replied. "Family members, the attorney, even Sheriff Briggs." She folded the blueprint carefully. The office stayed locked. On the way back to the store, David couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. That evening, he walked once again to the rear hallway. The heavy office door looked exactly as it had the night before. The brass lock remained polished from decades of use. But unlike the front entrance, there were no scratches around the keyhole, no pry marks, no signs that anyone had ever tried to force it open. He crouched to examine it more closely. The lock appeared older than the rest of the hardware in the building. It wasn't the kind of key sold in ordinary hardware stores. Whatever key Richard Harper had carried had been made specifically for that office. David rested one hand on the weathered wood. Behind the door lay the only room in the building that had remained untouched since the day his uncle died. According to everyone in town, no one had entered it in years, and judging by the untouched lock still waiting quietly beneath his fingertips, no one ever had. David returned to the library the following morning carrying a notebook filled with questions. The locked office had occupied his thoughts since the previous night. If no one had entered it since Richard Harper passed away, then whatever remained inside had been waiting for years. Yet Margaret's archive suggested there was another mystery hidden beneath the locked door itself. Entire sections of the store's history seemed to have quietly disappeared. Margaret greeted him with a warm smile before leading him back into the local history room. Several archive boxes already sat waiting on the large wooden table. "I pulled everything connected to the store," she said. "At least, everything we still have." David spent the next several hours sorting through business licenses, supplier invoices, newspaper advertisements, and town council records. At first, the documents appeared remarkably complete. Every delivery of flour, canned goods, coffee, seed, hardware, and household supplies had been carefully recorded. Seasonal advertisements announced harvest sales, Christmas events, and community gatherings sponsored by Harper's General Store. Richard's handwriting appeared often neat, organized, and consistent. Then the records suddenly changed. One accounting ledger ended halfway through a year. The next volume picked up almost 4 years later. Entire binders that should have filled the gap were simply gone. David frowned. Were they lost? Margaret adjusted her glasses and studied the shelf inventory beside the files. "I've wondered that for years." She pointed toward several missing archive numbers. "These boxes existed once. Someone removed them long before I became librarian." David continued searching. Newspaper articles from the missing years still mentioned the general store almost every week. Families donated food through the shop after severe storms. Local charities organized collection drives there. School fundraisers accepted supplies from Richard Harper. The business had clearly remained active, even while much of its financial history vanished from public records. Margaret quietly closed another file. The store never stopped serving the town. David looked up, but someone stopped keeping or sharing the records. Before Margaret could answer, the library door opened. A tall, older man, wearing a weathered sheriff's jacket, stepped inside, carrying several books beneath one arm. Margaret smiled. Perfect timing. She introduced him as Tom Briggs, the town's retired sheriff. Tom shook David's hand firmly. "You're Richard's nephew." David nodded. "I'm trying to understand the store." Tom pulled out a chair. "Then you're asking the right questions." For the next hour, Tom described the town during the difficult economic years several decades earlier. Small factories closed, farms struggled through drought. Families lost steady work almost overnight. Many businesses disappeared. Harper's General Store never did. "Folks kept wondering how Richard stayed open," Tom said. "He wasn't getting rich." David glanced toward the missing ledgers. "Did he ever ask the town for help?" Tom shook his hand. "Never." "Loans?" "No." "Donations?" Another quiet shake of the head. Tom leaned back thoughtfully. The strange thing is, people always managed to leave his store carrying groceries, even when everybody knew they couldn't afford much. David frowned. How? Tom smiled faintly. That's something Richard never talked about. Before David could ask another question, the front bell of the library chimed softly. Margaret looked toward the entrance and smiled. Well, here's someone who might know more than either of us. An elderly woman entered slowly, using a polished wooden cane. Though well into her 80s, her eyes remained bright and alert. Margaret introduced her as Ruth Harper, Richard's younger sister. David stood respectfully. Ruth smiled warmly after hearing his name. You have your father's eyes, she said softly. They sat together around the archive table. David carefully explained everything he had discovered so far. The locked office, the missing records, and the unanswered questions. Ruth listened without interrupting. Finally, she folded her hands together. People think my brother spent his life selling groceries. She smiled gently. That was only part of his work. David leaned forward. Margaret found missing business records. Ruth nodded slowly. Richard kept the important books himself. Tom exchanged a curious glance with Margaret. Important books? Ruth looked toward the old archive shelves before answering. Not the tax records, she paused. The ones that mattered most, David asked quietly. Where did he keep them? Ruth's expression became thoughtful. For several long seconds, she remained silent. Finally, she looked directly at David. Richard always believed certain things deserved privacy. Are the missing books inside the office? David asked. Ruth smiled sadly but did not answer the question directly. Instead, she reached into her handbag and removed an old black and white photograph showing Richard standing proudly behind the store counter many years earlier. Behind him, barely visible through the open office doorway, stood shelves filled with neatly arranged ledgers. Ruth placed the photograph gently onto the table. Those shelves weren't there by accident. David studied the image carefully. It was the clearest view anyone had yet seen of the office interior. Do you know what's on those shelves? He asked. Ruth rested one hand on the faded photograph. Yes. Hope flickered across David's face. Will you tell me? She looked toward the library window where afternoon sunlight stretched across the town square. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm but certain. Not yet. David waited. Ruth smiled kindly before carefully returning the photograph to her bag. Your uncle protected those books for a reason. She slowly rose from her chair with the help of her cane. If you're patient enough to understand why, you'll eventually understand where he hid them. With that, she quietly walked toward the library door, leaving David staring at the empty place where the photograph had rested, and wondering what could possibly be so important that Richard Harper had spent a lifetime keeping it hidden. David left the library carrying more questions than answers. Ruth Harper had confirmed that the missing ledgers were real, yet she refused to explain what they contained. The old photograph showing shelves inside the locked office remained fixed in his mind during the short walk back to the general store. If those shelves still stood untouched behind the door, then decades of unanswered history might still be waiting exactly where Richard Harper had left it. Ben Cooper was already on the front porch replacing another section of weathered railing when David arrived. You look like somebody handed you a mystery instead of an inheritance, Ben joked. David smiled faintly. That's about right. He told Ben about the missing records, Sheriff Briggs' memories, and Ruth's refusal to explain the hidden ledgers. Ben listened quietly before wiping sawdust from his hands. "Well," he said, "we can't solve anything standing out here." Together they walked through the store toward the narrow hallway behind the counter. Morning sunlight reached only partway down the corridor, leaving the heavy office door resting in cool shadow. It appeared exactly as it had every day since David arrived. Thick oak boards, a polished brass handle, an old lock untouched by scratches or damage. Ben crouched beside the lock and examined it carefully. "Nobody ever tried forcing this," he observed. David nodded. "Margaret said no one had the key." Ben ran one finger around the brass faceplate. "Most people would have broken the door open." "Apparently they respected Richard too much," Ben smiled. "Or they knew he had a reason." He removed a flashlight from his toolbox and studied the lock more closely. Unlike modern locks, this one featured an unusually long keyway disappearing deep into the mechanism. Decorative engravings surrounded the brass escutcheon, worn smooth by years of careful use. "This wasn't bought from a catalog," Ben murmured. "Somebody ordered this lock specifically for this office." David looked surprised. "Custom made?" Ben nodded. "You don't see keys like this anymore." Hoping to learn more, they carefully removed the brass faceplate without disturbing the lock itself. Years of dust had gathered beneath the hardware, but the mechanism remained remarkably clean. Richard had obviously maintained it throughout his life. "Whoever built this expected it to last," Ben said as he reattached the plate. David rested his hand on the worn door. Then whatever he locked inside must have mattered. As they continued examining the frame, Ben noticed something unusual near shoulder height. Set into the center of the door was a narrow brass slot, almost invisible beneath layers of old varnish. David brushed away the dust with his sleeve. "It's a mail slot." Ben nodded slowly. "Or a document slot." The small hinged cover opened with a gentle creak. Beyond it stretched only darkness. David crouched and shined his flashlight through the narrow opening. At first, he could see almost nothing except floating dust particles. Then his eyes slowly adjusted. Wooden shelves lined the far wall exactly as they had appeared in Ruth's old photograph. Most remained filled with binders, ledgers, and document boxes stacked in careful rows. Nothing appeared disturbed. The office looked frozen in time. "Can you see much?" Ben asked quietly. David shifted the flashlight a little farther through the opening. A sturdy oak desk stood near the center of the room. Papers remained neatly arranged on its surface beneath a layer of dust. A reading lamp rested beside an ink bottle. Framed photographs still hung on the wall. Everything suggested Richard had left the office intentionally rather than abandoning it. "It's all still there," David whispered. Ben took a turn looking through the slot before stepping back in amazement. "I've lived here my whole life," he said softly. "I've never seen inside that room." David continued studying the office through the narrow opening. He noticed no signs of hidden safes, valuable antiques, or expensive collections. Instead, every shelf seemed devoted to records. Dozens upon dozens of ledgers stood waiting exactly where Richard had placed them years before. "Those books," David murmured. "They have to be the missing records." Ben nodded. "Looks that way." David reached one finger carefully through the slot, hoping to touch the nearest shelf. It was still several feet beyond his reach. Whoever designed the office had intentionally positioned everything well away from the door, making it impossible to retrieve anything without opening it properly. As Ben prepared to close the brass cover again, David noticed one final detail. Mounted on the inside wall beside the desk hung a wooden key rack. Every hook stood empty. Ben gently lowered the small hinged cover until it clicked shut once more. Silence filled the hallway. David rested his hand against the weathered oak. The answers were no longer imaginary. They were only a few feet away, waiting patiently behind the locked door. The office had survived untouched for decades, preserving every ledger, every document, and every photograph exactly as Richard Harper intended. But without the unusual key that fit the custom-made lock, those shelves and the truth they held would remain just beyond reach. David could not stop thinking about the rows of untouched ledgers he had glimpsed through the narrow document slot. They were close enough to see, yet completely out of reach. The locked office no longer felt like an empty room. It felt like the heart of the old general store, patiently waiting for someone to understand why it had been sealed in the first place. The following morning, he drove to Ruth Harper's farmhouse, carrying the faded photograph she had shown him at the library. Ruth welcomed him onto the front porch with 2 cups of coffee already waiting on a small wooden table. "I had a feeling you'd come back," she said with a gentle smile. David admitted that he had looked inside the office through the document slot. "The shelves are still there," he said quietly. "Every ledger is exactly where your brother left it." Ruth closed her eyes for a brief moment, almost relieved. "Then time has been kind." They sat together while morning sunlight warmed the porch. For the first time, Ruth began speaking not about the building, but about her brother himself. Richard Harper had never considered the general store simply a business. Long before large supermarkets reached nearby cities, the store had served as the center of daily life. Farmers gathered there before sunrise to drink coffee. School children stopped by for candy after classes. Families exchanged news while buying flour, nails, lamp oil, and winter blankets. "People think he sold groceries," Ruth said softly. "What he really provided was stability." David listened as she described difficult years when factories closed and several harvests failed. Many families struggled to buy even basic necessities. Some businesses refused to extend credit because they feared losing money themselves. Richard made different choices. "He believed hunger made people desperate," Ruth explained. "Embarrassment made them disappear." David remembered Sheriff Briggs saying that somehow everyone still left the store carrying groceries, even when no one understood how they had paid. Ruth smiled sadly. "Richard never liked seeing anyone leave empty-handed." David hesitated before asking the question that had followed him since inheriting the store. "Did he keep records of those families?" Ruth looked toward the quiet fields surrounding her home. "He kept records of everything." "Inside the office?" She nodded once. "Yes." David leaned forward. "Why lock the room?" Ruth's expression became thoughtful. "Because those books didn't belong to curious people." She paused before continuing. "Imagine losing your job. Imagine walking into a store with children waiting at home and not having enough money for bread, milk, or medicine." David didn't answer. He no longer had to imagine unemployment. Now imagine the entire town learning about it years later. Ruth gently folded her hands together. Richard believed kindness should never become someone else's embarrassment. David remained silent while her words settled in his mind. The locked office suddenly seemed less mysterious and more protective. Perhaps Richard had never intended to hide wealth at all. Perhaps he had simply hidden other people's hardest moments. Ruth stood and disappeared inside the house for a few minutes. When she returned, she carried an old wooden box filled with family photographs. Together, they sorted through pictures of holiday gatherings, town festivals, and community picnics. Nearly every event included Richard somewhere in the background, smiling quietly behind the store counter or serving coffee to neighbors. One photograph showed him standing beside several children during a Christmas toy drive. Another captured volunteers loading food baskets into pickup trucks after a severe winter storm. "He never wanted attention," Ruth said. "He always stepped behind someone else when a photograph was taken." David noticed something unusual in another picture showing Richard locking the office door at closing time. Hanging from his belt was a long brass key, unlike any ordinary house key. "Is that the office key?" Ruth studied the image closely before nodding. "Yes." David looked at her hopefully. "Do you know where it went?" Ruth smiled faintly, but shook her head. "Not anymore." For several moments they continued sorting photographs without speaking. Then Ruth suddenly stopped. Her eyes focused on one small picture showing Richard standing beside an old delivery truck parked behind the store. In the background sat a weathered wooden workbench. Resting on top of it was a small blue tin box. Ruth stared at the photograph much longer than the others. "I haven't thought about that box in years," she whispered. David looked from the photograph to Ruth. "What is it?" She slowly traced the edge of the picture with one finger. "Richard kept odds and ends in there. Spare keys, receipts, small tools." David felt a spark of hope. "Do you still have it?" Ruth remained quiet for several seconds before answering, "I don't know." She looked toward the old barn standing beyond the house. "After Richard passed away, we stored several of his things without opening every box." David followed her gaze. The weathered barn doors stood slightly open beneath the afternoon sun. Ruth smiled gently. "If that old blue tin box is anywhere." She paused, her eyes still fixed on the forgotten building. "I think I know exactly where we should start looking." The next morning, David met Ruth outside the weathered barn behind her farmhouse just after sunrise. Dew still covered the grass, and the old wooden doors groaned softly as Ben Cooper pulled them fully open. At Ruth's request, Ben had driven over with his pickup and a few empty storage crates. "If we're going digging through 40 years of forgotten boxes," he said with a grin, "we might as well do it properly." Inside, the barn smelled of dry timber, old hay, and machine oil. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with labeled crates, worn furniture, rusted farm tools, and family keepsakes that had not been disturbed in decades. Sunlight slipped through narrow gaps between the wooden boards, illuminating tiny clouds of dust drifting through the air. Ruth walked slowly between the shelves, stopping every few steps as old memories returned. "After Richard passed away," she explained, "we packed everything that wasn't needed immediately. Most of it ended up here." David carefully lifted one box after another onto a long work table, while Ben opened each lid. They found holiday decorations, faded account books from the farmhouse, old lanterns, kitchen utensils, and family photographs. Every discovery revealed another piece of the Harper family's history, but nothing connected to the locked office. Nearly 2 hours passed before Ruth suddenly pointed toward a high shelf hidden behind several empty grain sacks. "There," she whispered. Ben climbed a ladder and carefully lowered a small blue tin box coated with years of dust. The faded paint matched the one in the old photograph exactly. David brushed away the dirt before gently opening the lid. Inside lay dozens of ordinary objects collected over a lifetime. Spare cabinet keys, loose screws, pocket knives, old receipts folded into small squares, a cracked fountain pen, buttons, coins. Nothing immediately resembled the long brass office key from the photograph. David searched each compartment carefully while Ruth watched in thoughtful silence. At the very bottom rested a false cardboard insert that had warped slightly with age. Ben noticed the uneven edge first. "Hold on," he said quietly. Using the tip of a small screwdriver, he lifted the thin panel. Hidden beneath it rested a narrow cloth pouch tied with faded string. David untied the knot slowly. A heavy brass key slid gently into his hand. It was longer than any ordinary key, with intricate cuts along the shaft and the familiar Harper family initials engraved into its rounded handle. Ruth smiled through tears. "That's Richard's office key." David turned it over in the morning light. Decades of careful handling had polished the brass until it still reflected softly despite its age. "He hid it inside the box all along," David murmured. Ruth nodded. "Only someone who knew about the false bottom would ever find it." Ben laughed quietly. "Your brother certainly knew how to keep a secret." They returned to the general store that afternoon carrying the recovered key inside a small cloth pouch. David walked directly to the narrow hallway behind the counter while Ben gathered several bottles of machine oil, soft brushes, and fine polishing cloths. Although they finally possessed the missing key, no one wanted to force a lock that had remained untouched for so many years. Ben carefully cleaned the brass faceplate before applying a tiny amount of oil inside the keyway. "Old locks seize when they're ignored," he explained. "Patience usually works better than strength." David watched as Ben gently worked the mechanism using a small service tool, loosening years of hardened dust without disturbing the delicate internal parts. After several minutes, Ben stepped aside. "All right," he said softly. "She's ready whenever you are." David took a slow breath and held the brass key in both hands. It fit naturally into his palm, its surprising weight making the moment feel even more significant. Ruth stood quietly beside him, while Ben waited a respectful distance away. David inserted the key into the lock. It slid smoothly through the long keyway until it stopped with a satisfying metallic click. No resistance, no scraping. It fit perfectly. For several silent seconds, no one moved. David slowly wrapped his fingers around the key and applied the gentlest pressure. At first, nothing happened. Then, deep inside the old lock, a faint metallic sound echoed through the hallway. One tumbler shifted into place. David looked toward Ben. Ben smiled encouragingly. "Don't rush it." David turned the key a little farther. Another quiet click answered from inside the mechanism. The brass handle beneath the lock seemed to relax almost imperceptibly after decades of remaining perfectly still. Ruth clasped her hands together, her eyes fixed on the old door. David could almost hear his own heartbeat. One final, careful movement. The key turned slightly farther than before. Somewhere inside the thick oak door, the hidden mechanism awakened one piece at a time, as though recognizing a familiar hand after years of silence. The lock had begun to move, but the heavy bolt still remained firmly seated inside the frame, holding the office closed for just a little longer. David kept one hand wrapped around the brass key, while the others stood silently behind him. The old mechanism had already begun to move, something no one in town believed would ever happen again. The hallway felt unusually quiet. Even the familiar creaking of the old building seemed to fade as everyone waited for the next sound. Ben rested one hand lightly against the office door. "Try just a little farther," he said softly. David nodded. He turned the key another fraction of an inch. Deep inside the lock, a heavy bolt slid backward with a slow metallic scrape. The sound echoed through the narrow hallway like an old clock beginning to tick after years of silence. Ruth closed her eyes and smiled. "I remember that sound," she whispered. David released the key and carefully reached for the brass handle. At first, it refused to move. Ben applied gentle pressure near the hinges while David tried again. The handle slowly lowered. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the weathered oak door shifted slightly inside its frame. A faint rush of cool air escaped through the narrow opening, carrying the scent of aged paper, cedarwood, coffee beans, and old leather. It was the unmistakable smell of a room that had remained undisturbed for decades. Together, David and Ben slowly pushed the heavy door inward. The old hinges groaned softly, but held firm. Sunlight from the hallway stretched across the wooden floor, revealing tiny dust particles floating through the still air. No one spoke. The room appeared exactly as though Richard Harper had stepped away for lunch and never returned. A sturdy oak desk stood neatly arranged near the center of the office. An open ledger rested beside an ink bottle that had long since dried. A pair of reading glasses lay folded on top of several carefully stacked envelopes. Nothing had been scattered. Nothing suggested anyone had searched the room after Richard's death. Along the rear wall stood tall wooden bookshelves filled with ledgers, journals, binders, and document boxes arranged with remarkable precision. Each spine carried handwritten labels in Richard's familiar neat lettering. Years, customer names, inventory categories, community events, everything occupied its proper place. Ben slowly removed his cap. It's like time stopped. David stepped carefully inside, making sure not to disturb anything unnecessarily. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his feet. Every object reflected quiet order rather than secrecy. There were no expensive antiques or signs of hidden wealth. Instead, the office felt like the private workspace of a man who valued organization above everything else. Ruth entered next. Her eyes slowly moved around the room before settling on the old desk. She smiled gently. He always kept fresh flowers there. She pointed toward a small ceramic vase that still rested beside the window, now holding only dried stems that had faded decades earlier. David noticed framed photographs lining one shelf. Some showed town festivals. Others captured smiling children gathered outside the store during Christmas celebrations. One picture showed Richard standing beside volunteers loading food boxes into pickup trucks after a flood. In every photograph, he stood slightly behind everyone else, smiling quietly while others occupied the center. He never wanted attention, Ruth said softly. David opened one drawer of the desk. Inside rested neatly arranged pencils, postage stamps, paper clips, and handwritten reminder notes. Another drawer contained correspondence with suppliers, holiday order forms, and community donation requests. Everything remained meticulously filed. Ben examined the bookshelves more closely. These aren't financial records, he observed after reading several labels. Not most of them. David pulled one ledger from the shelf. It contained inventory lists for canned goods and hardware. Another recorded seasonal deliveries. A third documented repairs made to the building itself over several decades. The office contained far more history than anyone expected, but nothing yet explained the missing years Margaret had discovered in the archives. As David continued exploring, something caught his attention in the far corner of the room. Standing beside the rear wall was a tall oak filing cabinet with 4 wide drawers. Unlike every other piece of furniture in the office, this cabinet remained locked. A small brass keyhole sat beneath the top drawer handle. David tested it gently. It would not move. Ben knelt to inspect the lock. Different mechanism, he said quietly. Not connected to the office key. Ruth slowly walked toward the cabinet. Her expression changed the moment she saw it. She reached out and rested one hand against the polished wood. "I haven't thought about this cabinet in years," she whispered. David looked at her. "Do you know what's inside?" Ruth remained silent for several moments before answering. "Richard never let anyone open it." The room grew quiet once again. After everything they had discovered, another locked compartment waited inside the office itself. David glanced back across the shelves filled with orderly records, then toward the solitary cabinet standing apart from everything else. If the office preserved Richard Harper's daily work, perhaps the locked cabinet protected the one part of his life he had never intended the world to see until the right time finally arrived. The locked filing cabinet stood quietly in the corner of Richard Harper's office, almost hidden behind the larger bookshelves. After finally opening a room that had remained sealed for decades, David found it strange that another mystery still waited inside. The office itself had revealed an orderly life, but the cabinet suggested Richard had chosen to separate certain records from everything else. Ben examined the brass lock carefully before smiling. "This one's much simpler than the office door." He reached into the drawer of the old desk where dozens of neatly labeled keys remained hanging on small hooks. One by one, he tested them against the cabinet lock, while David and Ruth continued exploring the office. On the fourth attempt, the lock turned smoothly. The top drawer slid open with almost no resistance. Inside lay hundreds of neatly arranged envelopes tied into bundles with faded cotton ribbon. Every bundle carried handwritten labels listing family names rather than business categories. David carefully untied the first ribbon and removed a single envelope. It contained a handwritten letter dated more than 30 years earlier. The paper had yellowed with age, but the careful writing remained perfectly clear. A local widow thanked Richard for allowing her to take groceries home after her husband became seriously ill. She promised to repay every dollar as soon as she found work again. Folded behind the letter rested a small receipt stamped with one simple phrase: "Balance cleared." David looked toward Ruth. "He never collected the money." Ruth gently shook her hand. "Keep reading." The next envelope told a similar story. A farming family whose crops had failed thanked Richard for quietly extending credit through an entire winter. Attached to their receipt appeared the same red stamp: "Balance cleared." Another letter came from a young couple expecting their first child. Another from an elderly veteran struggling to pay heating bills. Every envelope contained gratitude rather than debt. Every receipt ended exactly the same way. David opened bundle after bundle. None of them described unpaid bills being sent to collections. None threatened legal action. Every family had believed they owed Richard money. Every account had quietly been erased instead. Ben opened the second drawer of the filing cabinet. Instead of letters, it contained carefully organized purchase slips arranged by year. Thousands of handwritten receipts filled the folders. Margaret Ellis arrived later that afternoon after David called the library. Wearing white archival gloves, she helped examine the fragile documents without damaging them. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered. She lifted one folder toward the light. "These aren't ordinary business records." David nodded. "They're almost entirely credit purchases." Margaret continued reading. "Groceries, flour, milk, medicine, coal, blankets, school supplies." Every receipt listed essential items families needed to survive difficult times. None contained luxury purchases. Richard had quietly recorded every dollar, every loaf of bread, every bag of flour. Yet attached to nearly every account appeared the familiar red stamp declaring the balance completely forgiven. Sheriff Tom Briggs stopped by the store after hearing the office had finally been opened. David showed him several of the recovered files. Tom studied them in complete silence before slowly removing his glasses. "All these years," he murmured. "People thought folks somehow found ways to pay him back." David looked at another cleared receipt. "Most never did." Tom shook his head gently. "Richard never wanted anyone to know." Ruth smiled softly. "That's exactly why he locked the office." Margaret carefully placed the letters into protective archival sleeves, while David continued searching through the remaining drawers. The third drawer contained community donation records, holiday food basket lists, and handwritten notes reminding Richard which families might need extra help before winter. Besides several names, he had written simple reminders. "Leave on the porch before sunrise. Don't mention payment. Children first." David paused after reading those words. Everything inside the cabinet reflected the same quiet pattern. Richard had never helped people publicly. He protected their dignity as carefully as he protected his business records. Ben slid open the final drawer. Unlike the others, it contained only a single oversized ledger resting alone inside a wooden tray. The dark leather cover showed years of careful handling. No title appeared on the front. No label identified its contents. It simply waited beneath a thin layer of dust. Margaret looked toward David. "This might be the missing record." David carefully lifted the heavy book from the drawer. It weighed far more than the other ledgers lining the office shelves. As he carried it to Richard's desk, everyone gathered quietly around. Ruth gently rested one hand on the worn leather cover. "I've never seen inside it," she admitted. David slowly opened the front cover. Before he could read the first page, a folded handwritten note slipped onto the desk. The familiar handwriting was unmistakably Richard Harper's. David looked down at the unopened ledger, then at the note lying beside it. Whatever answers the town had been searching for all these years were no longer hidden behind locked doors or forgotten cabinets. They were waiting inside the pages of the final book Richard Harper had chosen to leave behind. David carefully unfolded the handwritten note that had slipped from the large leather ledger. The familiar handwriting belonged unmistakably to Richard Harper. Unlike the neat business record surrounding it, this message contained only a single sentence. "Before you judge these numbers, remember the people behind them." No signature followed. No explanation. David quietly placed the note beside the ledger before opening the heavy cover. The first pages immediately looked different from every other business record in the office. Instead of inventory lists or supplier invoices, each page contained the names of local families arranged in careful alphabetical order. Beside every name, Richard had recorded dates, grocery purchases, medicine, blankets, coal, school supplies, and other everyday necessities. Across the top of the first page, written in bold block letters, appeared two simple words: Community Credit. Margaret adjusted her archival gloves before leaning closer. "This is the missing ledger," she whispered. David slowly turned another page. Every account listed small balances accumulated over weeks or months. Some families owed only a few dollars. Others carried larger amounts after difficult winters or poor harvests. Everything looked exactly like an ordinary credit ledger until David reached the far right column. Instead of payment dates or collection records, every account ended with the same red stamp: Paid in full. He frowned. That doesn't make sense. Sheriff Tom Briggs stepped closer. "Why not?" David pointed toward several entries. "There's no record of payment." Margaret examined another page. No receipts either. They continued turning pages. Every family followed the same pattern: purchases, running balance, Then, without explanation, the entire amount disappeared beneath the familiar stamp. Paid in full. Not a single account showed money actually being collected. Sheriff Briggs slowly removed his glasses and looked down at the open book. "I worked in this town for 32 years, he said quietly. People always believed Richard eventually got his money back." David shook his head. According to this, he gently touched one of the stamped pages. He never did. Ruth smiled sadly. "I told him many times he couldn't keep doing it forever." David looked at her. "What did he say?" She laughed softly through moist eyes. "He always answered the same way." She paused before repeating her brother's words exactly as she remembered them. "People aren't debts. Hard times are." Silence settled over the office. David continued reading. Beside many accounts, Richard had written small personal notes in the margins. Lost his factory job. Husband recovering from surgery. Children need winter boots. Wait until harvest. Never mention this to anyone. Every entry revealed another quiet act of compassion, carefully hidden behind ordinary bookkeeping. Margaret looked overwhelmed. "He wasn't tracking profits." David nodded slowly. "He was tracking who needed help." Ben opened another section of the ledger covering a particularly difficult economic period. Entire pages filled with community names appeared one after another. Hundreds of purchases: flour, bread, milk, baby formula, medicine, heating coal, school notebooks. Yet every balance ended exactly the same way. Paid in full. "He erased everything," Ben whispered. Sheriff Briggs leaned against the old desk. "That explains something I've wondered about for years." Everyone looked toward him. "During the recession," he continued, "almost nobody lost their farm around here." He smiled faintly. "We always assumed people somehow found extra work." Ruth quietly shook her head. "Many never could." David looked back at the ledger. Richard had quietly carried those unpaid balances himself rather than allowing families to fall deeper into hardship. Not for publicity, not for recognition, simply because he believed they deserved another chance. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the office floor, David reached the final pages of the ledger. There the handwriting became slightly slower, revealing Richard's advancing age. The final accounts carried the same careful attention as the first. Every remaining balance had been marked "paid in full" in steady red ink. Behind the last customer entry rested a folded sheet of stationery tucked neatly inside the back cover. Unlike the brief note found at the beginning, this page contained several paragraphs written only weeks before Richard's death. David carefully unfolded it, but stopped before reading aloud. He recognized immediately that this was not another business record. It was the final page of Richard Harper's personal journal. Ruth quietly lowered herself into a nearby chair. Margaret closed her notebook. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat. Ben stepped back without saying a word. The entire room seemed to understand that whatever Richard had written on those last pages would finally explain why one ordinary general store had remained the quiet heart of an entire town for so many years. David unfolded the final journal page with both hands, careful not to damage the aging paper. The office remained completely silent. Ruth sat quietly beside the desk while Margaret, Ben, and Sheriff Briggs waited without speaking. Even after everything they had discovered, David sensed that Richard Harper had saved his most important message for the very end. The handwriting was slower than the earlier records, but every word remained clear. Richard wrote that many people believed a general store survived by collecting every dollar it was owed. He admitted that he had once believed the same thing when he first inherited the business from his own father. Then came years of layoffs, failed harvests, illnesses, and families who quietly stopped walking through the front door because they were ashamed they could no longer pay. Richard explained that he had watched proud people choose hunger rather than embarrassment. That was the day he stopped measuring success by the balance inside his cash register. Instead, he began measuring it by how many neighbors could keep going until life became kinder again. The final paragraph was short. If you are reading this, the store now belongs to someone else. I hope you understand why these records were never displayed on the front counter. Every unpaid bill in these pages represents someone who trusted me on the hardest day of their life. Their dignity was always worth more than the money they owed. David quietly lowered the letter. No one spoke for several moments. Sheriff Briggs finally broke the silence. "I spent my career trying to protect this town," he said softly. "Richard was doing it the whole time from behind his cash register." During the following weeks, the general store slowly began to change. Ben repaired the remaining sections of the front porch, restored the original shelving, and rebuilt the weathered storefront sign using photographs from Margaret's archives. The faded words "Harper's General Store" once again welcomed visitors from across the town square. Margaret carefully preserved every letter, receipt, journal, and ledger recovered from the locked office. Each document was placed inside archival sleeves and stored in climate-safe boxes before selected copies were displayed in a small historical exhibit near the back of the store. The locked office itself remained exactly as Richard had left it. David refused to modernize it. The oak desk, bookshelves, photographs, and filing cabinet stayed in their original places so future generations could understand the quiet life Richard had lived. Ruth visited often, bringing family photographs and forgotten stories that helped identify many of the names found inside the credit ledgers. More than once, older residents stopped by and quietly recognized a parent's handwriting or a grandparent's receipt. Some wiped away tears after discovering balances they never knew had been forgiven. Others simply stood silently in front of the display, realizing for the first time why their families had survived years they once believed impossible. One Saturday afternoon, the town gathered for the official reopening of Harper's General Store. There were no grand advertisements or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Neighbors brought homemade pies, children laughed on the restored porch, and longtime residents wandered slowly through the aisles, remembering a place many thought they had lost forever. Margaret spoke briefly about the history of the store. Sheriff Briggs thanked Richard Harper for serving the town in ways no one had fully understood until now. Ruth unveiled the original wooden store sign that had hung above the entrance decades earlier. Finally, David stepped behind the old counter where Richard had spent so many years greeting customers. Looking across the familiar faces gathered inside the store, he realized something unexpected. A month earlier, he had believed losing his job at 41 had ended his future. Instead, it had quietly led him to the place where he finally understood what meaningful work looked like. He announced that one corner of the store would become a permanent community pantry stocked with donated food for anyone facing difficult times. No questions asked, no paperwork, no public attention. Beside it, he created a small emergency credit program for local families experiencing temporary hardship. The names would remain private, just as Richard had always believed they should. Above the cash register, David hung a simple wooden plaque carved with the final sentence from Richard's journal. A good store doesn't measure customers by what they owe, but by the chance they deserve. Every morning before unlocking the front door, David paused to read those words. They reminded him that the building he inherited had never truly been about groceries, shelves, or sales. It had always been about people. Late one evening, after the final customer left, David walked into the restored office and looked around the quiet room one last time before locking the door for the night. Unlike before, the office was no longer locked to hide a mystery. It remained protected to honor the trust hundreds of families had placed in one ordinary shopkeeper. As he switched off the light, David smiled to himself. Losing his career had once felt like the worst day of his life. Looking back now, he understood it had also been the day his real purpose quietly began. The greatest secret hidden inside the locked office was never the office itself. It was the reason Richard Harper chose to lock it. When people hear about a forgotten room sealed for decades, they expect hidden cash, a safe full of gold, old property deeds, a fortune waiting for the next owner. Richard left none of those things behind. Instead, he left evidence of quiet kindness. Every ledger inside that office told the same story. A widow who couldn't afford groceries after losing her husband, a farmer whose crops failed before harvest, a family buying blankets during the coldest winter they had ever known, a father who needed medicine before he could return to work. Every purchase was carefully written down. Every dollar was recorded. Every account looked exactly like an ordinary business ledger, until the final column. Again and again, the same two words appeared in bright red ink: paid in full. Not because the customers came back with money, not because someone else settled their debt, but because Richard Harper quietly erased it himself. He never announced it. He never asked for recognition. He never told the town what he was doing. Most people believed Harper's General Store survived because Richard was an excellent businessman. The truth was much simpler. He believed no family should go hungry simply because they were living through the worst season of their lives. Richard understood something many people forget. Hard times eventually end, but the shame of asking for help can last forever. That was why he locked the office. Not to protect money, to protect people. If those ledgers had remained on the front counter, every neighbor would have known who couldn't pay for bread, who needed medicine on credit, who depended on someone else's kindness just to survive another week. Richard refused to let generosity become another person's humiliation, so he locked the door. He kept every promise. He carried every unpaid balance himself, and he waited until enough years had passed that those names would no longer represent embarrassment. Only history. When David Harper lost his job at 41, he believed his career had ended. Instead, he inherited something no paycheck could ever replace. A reminder that success isn't measured by the money a business collects. It's measured by the lives it quietly changes. The old general store never became famous. It never grew into a chain. It never appeared in business magazines. Yet for decades, it kept children fed, families together, and hope alive in a small town that never realized how much one quiet shopkeeper had sacrificed. Richard Harper never built his legacy with profit. He built it one forgiven debt at a time. And perhaps the most remarkable part of his story is this: many of the children whose names appeared in those ledgers grew up never knowing their parents' debts had been erased. They simply remembered that somehow their family always had food on the table. That is the kind of kindness that asks for nothing in return. A kindness so quiet, it remained hidden behind a locked office door for decades, until one unemployed man inherited an old general store and discovered that the greatest treasure a business can leave behind isn't wealth, it's compassion preserved for the next generation to continue.